Good morning everybody and welcome to Jackanory 2. George's Marvellous Medicine was our first fabulous story and now we're on with the twits. We started reading the book yesterday of course and we had a look at these two very strange, peculiar, grotesque characters and some of the things that they did to each other, some of the tricks that they played on each other. Well, we're going to continue with those tricks today and have a look at what Mr Twit does to Mrs Twit and what Mrs Twit does to Mr Twit, just so they can make each other laugh. Let's start with the next chapter. The next chapter is called The Frog. Here we go. I'll even do my funny voices. Okay. The Frog. To pay her back for the glass eye in the beer incident, which happened yesterday, Mr Twit decided he would put a frog in Mrs Twit's bed, as you do, just a frog in someone's bed. He caught a very big frog down by the pond and carried it back secretly in a box. That night, when Mrs Twit was in the bathroom getting ready for bed, Mr Twit slipped the frog between the sheets. Then he got into his own bed and waited for the fun to begin. Mrs Twit came back and she climbed into her bed. I'll use this as the bed. She lay there in the dark, scratching her tummy. Her tummy was itching. Dirty old hags like her always have itchy tummies. Then, all at once, she felt something cold and slimy crawling over her feet. And she screamed. Big scream. What's the matter with you? Mr Twit said. Help! Bouncing about in the bed. There was something in the bed! I'll bet it's that giant skilly wiggler I saw on the floor just before you came in, Mr Twit said. The what? Screamed Mrs Twit. I tried to kill it, but it got away. It's got teeth, all like screwdrivers. Help! Screamed Mrs Twit. Save me! It was all over my feet! Oh, that wouldn't have bitten your toes off, said Mr Twit. Mrs Twit fainted. Probably not try fainting. Mr Twit got out of bed and fetched a jug of cold water. He poured the water over Mrs Twit's head to bring her round. The frog crawled up from under the sheets because he could sense the water. And it started jumping around on the pillow. See, frogs love water. It makes them jump around. This one was just having a good time. When Mrs Twit finally felt like she was coming round, the frog then jumped up onto her head. This is not a nice thing to happen to anyone who's been trying to get to sleep at night. So she screamed again. Ah! By golly, it is a giant skilly wiggler and it's on my head! It's gonna bite off my nose! Mrs Twit leapt around the room and she decided to go downstairs and spend the night on the sofa instead. Meanwhile, the frog went to sleep on a bed, in particular on a pillow, in a puddle of water. The next day, to pay Mr Twit back for the frog trick, Mrs Twit sneaked out into the garden and dug up some worms. Garden like this one out here. When Mr Twit wasn't watching, she dug up several large worms. She chose big, long ones and put them in a tin, and she carried the tin back to the house under her apron. Is Mr Twit's around? Ah, not there. Right, we'll fix you. Mister, there's a frog in my bed, Twit. At 1 o'clock, she cooked spaghetti for lunch. And instead of filling it just with spaghetti, She put the long worms in with the spaghetti, but only on her husband's plate. The worms didn't show because everything was covered with tomato sauce and sprinkled with cheese. As he sat down to eat his dinner, Mr Twit noticed there was something rather, well, moving in his spaghetti. "Hey, my spaghetti's moving!" cried Mr Twit, poking around in it with his fork. "It's a new kind," Mrs Twit said, taking a mouthful from her own plate, which of course had no worms in it at all. "It's called squiggly spaghetti. It's delicious. Eat it up, love, while it's nice and hot. Got it special for you." Mr Twit shrugged his shoulders and started eating, twisting the long tomato-covered strings around his fork and shoveling them into his mouth. Soon there was tomato sauce all over his hairy beard. "It's not as good as the ordinary kind of spaghetti," he said, talking as he does with his mouth full. "It's very squishy." "No, I find it very tasty," Mrs Twit said. She was watching him from the other end of the table. It gave her great pleasure to watch him eating worms. "I think it's rather bitter. It's got a distinctly bitter flavour. Buy the other kind next time, Mrs Twit." Mrs Twit waited until Mr Twit had eaten the entire plateful. Then she said, "You want to know why your spaghetti was a bit squishy today?" Mr Twit wiped the tomato sauce from his beard with a corner of the tablecloth. "Why?" he said. "You want to know why it had a nasty bitter taste?" "Why?" he said again. "Because it was really worms, or some of it was worms," cried Mrs Twit, clapping her hands and stamping her feet on the floor and rocking with horrible laughter. "Worms in your spaghetti, and you didn't realise!" Mr Twit was not amused. He knew somewhere he had to get his own back for that particularly nasty trick. So, the way to get his own back was to plan a particularly devilish plot. This involved Mrs Twit's walking stick. To pay her back, he had a particularly nasty thing he wanted to do with it. One night, when his wife was asleep, he crept out of bed and he took a walking stick downstairs to his work shed. There he stuck a tiny round piece of wood, no thicker than a penny, onto the bottom of the stick. This made the stick longer, but the difference was quite small, and the next morning Mrs Twit didn't notice it as she walked with a stick down the stairs to the kitchen. The following night Mr Twit stuck another tiny bit of wood to the bottom of the walking stick, and every night he crept downstairs and added an extra tiny thickness of wood to the end of the walking stick. He did it very neatly so that the extra bits looked like part of the old stick. So gradually, but very gradually, Mrs Twit's walking stick was getting longer and longer and longer. Now, when something is growing very slowly, it's almost impossible to notice it happening. You yourself, for example, are actually growing taller every day that goes by, but you wouldn't think it, would you guys? You see, it's happening so slowly you can't even notice it from one week to the next. It was the same with Mrs Twit's walking stick. It was very slow and gradual, and she didn't notice how long it was getting, even when it was halfway up to her shoulder. "That stick is getting too long for you," Mr Twit said to her one day. "Why, so it is," Mrs Twit said, looking at the stick. "I've had a feeling there was something wrong, but I couldn't for the life of me think what it was." "There's something wrong, all right," Mr Twit said, beginning to enjoy himself. can have happened? Mrs Twit said, staring at her old walking stick. It must suddenly have grown longer. Don't be a fool. How can a walking stick grow? It's made of dead wood, isn't it? Dead wood cannot grow. Then what on earth has happened? Cried Mrs Twit. It's not the stick that's changing, it's you, Mrs Twit. It's you that's getting shorter. I've been noticing it for quite some time. That's not true. You're a shrinking woman. It's not possible. It is shrinking, woman. It jolly well is. You're shrinking fast. You're shrinking dangerously fast. Why, you must have shrunk at least 1 foot in the last few days. Never! She cried. Of course you have. Take a look at your stick, you old goat, and see how much you've shrunk in comparison. You've got the shrinks. That's what you've got. You've got dreaded shrinks. You've got dreaded shrinks. You've got dreaded shrinks. He loved chanting it and annoying his wife. Mrs Twit began to feel so trembly she had to sit down to gather herself. Did she really have the shrink, she thought to herself, and all the while Mr Twit was smiling behind his beard. We'll find out what happens next in tomorrow's episode. Can't wait. Will she play another trick to get her revenge? What will happen next in the terrible Twits household? Take care. Stay safe. See you tomorrow.